Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with Carl, one of our amazing technical volunteers, to tell you a little bit about MapAction and to see whether there might be possibilities for further cooperation. I mean, I think we're always looking for friends, supporters, technical specialists, problem solvers, and there's room for all of that. So this is just, I hope, the start of a conversation. I'm going to start and just tell you a little bit about the organisation and whisk you through that, and then I'm going to hand over to Carl, who's going to drill down a bit into two examples to give you a little taster of some of our data challenges, and particularly when we're trying to think about diversity. And I know you've had a lot of discussions about that today, but just to bring another perspective on it. So just to say that we work obviously in an international space. I want to sort of have a little caveat before we go too far to say that actually we're still very much learning as an organisation about diversity, even though we work in that international space. And we know that we have a long way to go to become ourselves more diverse, as you'll see when I show you a photo of our team, but also in terms of how we tackle these questions in very difficult situations. What we do know is that it's absolutely critical that we address the question of diversity if we want aid, humanitarian aid, to get to people as quickly as possible. And that if we don't consider the differences in the population that we're seeking to serve, it's very likely that we're going to miss people out who are in desperate need, whatever that diversity profile looks like in any given context. So, what do? MapAction is a humanitarian mapping charity that works through extremely skilled volunteers, of which Carl is one of our long-standing members who you've already seen his bio, done a lot to support the organisation. We have actually quite a small staff team, and we have most of our work delivered through our volunteers. What we're trying to do, and this will be very familiar to an audience like yourselves who deal with data all the time, is we're trying to inform delivery of humanitarian aid and make the aid effort more effective. And we're trying to do that by giving the right data in the right format to people as quickly as possible. And since 2002, we have responded to over 80 emergencies now. We had quite a slow start to the year, and I'm sad to say we've actually found ourselves speeding up now. As you know, humanitarian emergencies are often very complex and very confusing, and people do need information very, very rapidly. And I love that little statement on the last slide that said the art of the possible. That is very, very true in a humanitarian context. Nothing is perfect. It's often messy. You'll know better than anybody the power of data, data to tell and to mistell a story. We talk about disasters in terms of it being some sort of apolitical thing that happens on the planet. Actually, the truth of the matter is that vulnerable people are vulnerable for many political reasons. It's often rooted in their social, geopolitical context. So it's important that when we're thinking about vulnerability and why some people facing a hurricane will experience it in a much worse way than other people, that we understand why that is if we're going to address the problems and help them recover. As I said, we've done 80-odd missions around the globe, and we will work on any emergency in any situation, providing we think it's safe enough for our team to go. We have more recently been working not just in rapid onset disasters. I just shown you a picture of the earthquake in Nepal, but actually in complex emergencies like Afghanistan as well. Just to give you an idea of how it does work, though, in a rapid onset emergency, when a disaster strikes, we get a notification that an earthquake's taken place, usually within a few moments of that earthquake occurring. And it's a global message sent to all of the standby organisations that may be required to support the international effort. And something called a data scramble is then started, which you may be familiar with in your own environments. Carl may tell you something more about that in a minute. But essentially what we're doing is looking at the area of interest and very rapidly tasking our 80-odd volunteers to bring data forward from wherever they can find it that our team can use. And that data will then be put on a hard drive and given to the team that are dispatched at the airport. We, at the same time as getting the data scramble moving, we actually put out a note to our team by SMS asking people to sign up for their availability to deploy. And our team are usually able to do that within a couple of hours. So to give you an example of Nepal, we had a team ready within about 3 or 4 hours of that emergency to send them to Nepal. We have very light kit. It's basically everything that 2 people can carry in a couple of tin cases. And that can all be carried on usually a charter flight to the location. Sometimes we have to, commercial flight usually, sometimes we have to jump on a charter flight. And of course, particularly if it's an earthquake, the emphasis is all on rapid solutions to problems. We're really trying to help identify in a search and rescue scenario whether there are still people alive. And that's all about getting the coordination right, and that's where our data is particularly important. But it does mean that our team are often working under an extreme pressure because people will be waiting for them for the information in order to then work out who is, for example, searching what part of the city, depending on what search and rescue teams are in country. Ultimately, of course, it's not really about us, and I think we sit behind the front line in a way. If you're talking to an organisation like Save the Children or Oxfam, they will be right up there very close to what's actually happening. We will be sitting with colleagues in a coordination centre, either in the capital or in an affected area. So we're not right on the front line. We're very unlikely, actually, to meet anybody directly affected by a disaster. We may do if we do an assessment, and sometimes we do. But nonetheless, that is our goal, is to support those people, and it's important we always remember that. I chose this picture just because this is, I think, again, actually I'm not sure where this is. It might be Nepal, but I think it's not actually. Haiti. So we are sometimes finding ourselves in situations where we're intense, but actually that's not always the case. What is the case is that there is always a need for some sort of central coordination to support the government of the day who will have asked for international assistance. And this is one such coordination centre. And as you can see, it's very basic. It's quite low tech, as was needed really in Haiti, because the situation was such that that was the thing that worked. And so we make sure that whilst we want to be able to offer people highly technical solutions to their problems, sometimes it has to be very basic, and a printed map might be all it is. We work with the national authorities also on preparedness, and we do quite a lot of work with them on preparing the identification of what data they have, and that might involve working with national statistics agencies, the National Mapping Agency, the National Disaster Management Agencies, working out with them where their data is. Often very large emergencies bring with them a lot of high-profile attention, and indeed, as you might be aware from the Disaster Emergency Committee appeal that was launched in the UK for the Indonesia earthquake recently, it was very high profile because of the tsunami, I think, and brought a lot of attention. And so it's quite common that our team will find themselves briefing here. In fact, I think they're briefing the most senior person in the UN for humanitarian response, and possibly the Secretary General as well. I'm not quite sure actually if he was there as well, but I think he was. And it is, I guess, very important that we can do that briefing, because that often comes to the release of resources, and resources are critical in providing an adequate response. And we often feel we're failing to provide the adequate response that is so often needed because the problems are very difficult and very complex. But it's also important that we have people with feet on the ground, and that is a key area for us to do, and that's why we have our team either through preparedness and training or by deploying, as I've just talked to you through, to a response in a short notice deployment. This is our lovely team. I wanted you to meet them for 2 reasons. One, because they're wonderful and they do the work at the front line, but also because, as I said at the outset, I think it's very visible that there is a lot we need to do to take forward diversity really within our team. And what we have at the moment is one of our trustees establishing a working group within our organisation to look at how we might reach out to different communities and attract different participants in the organisation. It's certainly something that we are very keen to do. We have 82 volunteers. Most of them are UK-based, but not all of them. Carl lives in Belgium. We have somebody who's a representative in Dubai, somebody else in New Zealand and Australia. And largely it's people who have been members of the organisation and they've moved and been willing to take with them the volunteer portfolio for MapAction. We have 14.4 full-time staff, equivalent staff, most of whom are part-time, and we're based in Buckinghamshire. And we have a board of 12 trustees. Our volunteers give a lot of time to the organisation. When we assess them, which we do in Q1 of at the beginning of a year, we have a recruitment process. One of the main conversations we have with people is about the time that they are prepared to give to the organisation. Because apart from the deployments, which we expect people to go on roughly 1 2-week deployment a year, we also ask them to attend 7 to 8 trainings a year and to do all sorts of work behind the scenes. Carl used to run our technical capacity within the organisation in the evenings around his day job. All of them are senior professionals working in geospatial analysis or project management of some sort, but with geospatial or other technical backgrounds. So, diversity in a crisis, just very briefly, when does it matter and when doesn't it matter? I just thought I'd just show you a couple of maps and I'm going to hand over to Carl about this, because I think there are some situations where it might be obvious that actually showing diversity isn't important at this stage. And I would say here, a map, this is almost always one of the first maps that we'll produce, is a map about the impact area. Obviously, in that situation, it's not essential to be able to illustrate diversity. This map was showing the predicted and the actual storm track of Hurricane Maria, which is one of the Caribbean hurricanes last year. In some cases as well, one of the main things we end up doing is sorting out the reference information. And it's very common that in a situation where a country has experienced a hazard of some sort or a weather event that has led to it becoming a disaster, it's very likely that the data is not in very good shape in that country. And so one of the things we invariably find ourselves is establishing the reference maps that give the baseline. And on that we can then start to build things as we've done here, the story of the logistics, the roads and the key critical centres. That's all a starting point for then establishing the assessment process. This map is an urban rescue search and urban search and rescue who, what, where map. So what this is doing is helping the multiple search and rescue teams that were involved in the Ecuador response understand where one another is working. And that's the starting point for making sure that they're not duplicating. At this level, diversity may not be very important, but actually this is the point where we need to start understanding diversity issues, because if we don't, we are quite likely to potentially be missing parts of the population that may otherwise not be a priority of the government or of different teams contributing for whatever reason. So actually, although on the surface that doesn't look like a key issue, I think it is an issue, but it's a very difficult one for us as incoming personnel to wrestle with, because we don't know the context very often, unless we've worked there on a preparedness mission, and also because we will be working with people who will be steering us. So thinking about that is actually very important. And then lastly, this map was one that's actually about water delivery. And what it's showing you is where the water has been delivered, where it's been delivered and where there are remaining supplies. And I would suggest that it's actually at this point it gets very important to know about diversity. Because if we don't have an understanding of the profile of the population, those who may or may not be able to access the water as it's being provided here, then we will be missing people, and that will be very serious for them, obviously for something as vital as that. I'm going to hand over now to Carl.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Liz, for the introduction. I only briefly want to show two examples of products that MapAction produced in the past years. So this is a map that we produced for, in the Nepal earthquake. We had a large team there for many weeks. It was one of our really big response activities. And what you can see here is color-coded the different languages that people speak as their main language. So why is the language important? Nepal uses English as sort of its national common language. However, after the earthquake, the government and other organizations wanted to get messages out to the local population. And those messages work best in the local language. So if you take, say, language as a proxy for culture, for local cultures, for ethnicity maybe, then this, oops, sorry, didn't want to go there. Oh, great, always happens.
That one?
Yeah, we're back, sorry about that. Now how do I?
There's a laser point, is there a laser point on there?
I just want to scroll down my note here. Ah, found it, I think. I'm not very sure. Yeah, okay. So, the point that we wanted to make with this one, with this example, is that it's great if, as a humanitarian organization, you have the sort of ambition to drive a diversity agenda, but it's not only a sort of overarching ethical goal, it has very practical implications on the delivery of aid. If you can approach people in their national language, in their cultural context, that makes the communication much more straightforward, that makes the delivery of aid much more possible. This also shows one of the main issues we're having problems with. Data, of course. How do you get data about people's language, about people's say, ethnic situation, about people's, or about the affected areas, gender situation, etc. In this case, we actually were helped by a local academic who was very knowledgeable about his country and the cultural composition. Otherwise, that kind of data is very, very difficult to get hold of. It rarely shows up in government statistics, at least in the countries we work in. So here we were really lucky to have that local contact. And in the humanitarian aid world, there's very little sort of standardization of getting this kind of data and processing it. So yeah, that's another point. In terms of reliability of this data, we're always asked, how reliable is your data? If we produce, let's say, after the earthquake in the first phase, figures of the search and rescue efforts, how many areas have been searched, how many people have been saved. Of course, we always depend on the data we get. It's the same in your day jobs. You have only limited resources, of course, to verify data you get. We can do some sort of spot checks, but data quality is another very important issue for us. And of course, also as in the real world, as in the commercial world, every information product that we produce is, of course, a simplification. In the real world, of course, languages are not delineated by straight lines. You actually have much more of a patchwork. Again, it's very much a simplification, but it's good enough for the purpose it was intended for, and it was actually quite useful for getting the aid out to the people. Now, if we think further about diversity, as I said, we don't really have standardized methods and standardized data to represent diversity. So that's something where the community, the data community, is quite interesting for us to work with, because we are asking ourselves, well, if we want to include diversity, how do we indicate diversity? How do we measure it? How do we represent it? And people like you are the experts in data processing, in data representation. So I think there is quite some overlap between what we want to achieve and the skills and knowledge and experience that you have, mostly from your commercial environments. Okay, that was one example. Second example I wanted to show is a bit different. Yeah, you've seen it before. It's Syria, but it's actually not, it doesn't matter that it's about Syria. It's to show you how international aid flows work. Because many people think, well, there's a big crisis, there's an earthquake, there's a complex emergency like Syria, there's floods, and the UN comes in and delivers aid. And that's actually not how it works. How it works is that many international NGOs get involved, collect funding, collect donations, and then there's a whole logistics chain working mostly with local organizations, with organizations that are in country. So here you see, let's say aid is coming in through UN and international NGOs, but then goes to, here in this case, GOS, that's the government of Syria, SARC, that's the local Red Cross, or Red Crescent organization, local NGOs, and they actually do the distribution. So why does that matter? So that was an analysis that was done on Syria, but the same principle applies actually in any or in most humanitarian operations. And it matters because throughout the logistics chain, you can look at diversity at every single point. And the further you get down the chain, the further you get into the local level, usually the less diversity is taken into account. So on the Syria example, we did an analysis of the pre-crisis situation, and we were looking at NGOs that are active in Syria in 2013. And one of the findings, I'm not sure if you can read it there was a tendency within NGOs, within local NGOs, for the senior management to give priority to men, older people, and these with political or financial status to serve on the management team. So in other words, the NGOs, when they recruited their management teams, they had a clear preference for men, older people, and people with influence. Now, the argument is frequently that, well, if you want to get humanitarian aid done, if you want to get things done, you need to work with people who have influence. But actually, I think the humanitarian world is increasingly challenging that perception and increasingly trying to work outside these traditional mechanisms. And again, that's where the diversity agenda comes in. How those traditional mechanisms can be challenged is primarily from the funding side, because the donors, the people who give money to humanitarian organizations, the governments who give money to humanitarian organizations, maybe your own employers if you have charity programs, they can actually make diversity a condition of funding. And that's how diversity can be entrenched into the whole flow of humanitarian aid. So that was an example of Syria, but it works essentially in the same way in most countries. Yeah, that's the two cases I wanted to show. Should we go to questions? We go to questions. Thank you.